Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2025 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in memoir and creative nonfiction, which received yet again a record number of submissions. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as a Minnesota Center for the Book. And for many books, let's be real. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota. The Memoir and Creative Nonfiction category is sponsored by Bradshaw's Celebration of Life Centers. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Matt Eicheldinger, author of Sticky Notes, Memorable Lessons from Ordinary Moments, published by Andrews McMeel Publishing, Lindsey Henke, author of When Skies Are Gray, A Grieving Mother's Lullaby, published by She Writes Press, Teresa Peterson, author of Perennial Ceremony, published by University of Minnesota Press, and Kalia, author of Where Rivers Part, A Story of My Mother's Life, published by Atria Books and imprint of Simon & Schuster. So my name is Jeremy. I was picked not off the street, but because I was one of the finalists last year. It was a thrill to be nominated. It was a wonder to speak with the other finalists. And as another Minneapolis wordsmith, Dessa, says, always a bridesmaid, never an astronaut. So as a runner-up, I was honored to be included in this discussion. I'm really excited. I was thrilled and honored to read all four of your books, and I really look forward to speaking with you. Each of these works has what high school teachers would call a theme. But I felt each was driven more by a place or a space, whether a classroom, the endless stream of 12-year-olds, the grief and grieving space, the physical land and the cultivation of crops and culture, the physical past, the voices lost to history, sought in memory. I really enjoyed reading each and then considering them as a quartet in conversation with each other in my head. In that spirit, I'd like to share something that felt applicable to our four finalists from Teresa's poem, Seeding Another Generation.
Hand from hand they come, spanning across time, delivered to this very moment. Sown and cradled, nurtured in faith, they emerge. From cherished tears, suckled, and solar rays transformed.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's beautiful. I'm going to start the round robin with question number 2. In each of these works, I felt there was a thread or a string, call it the human connection, something being extended to connect and reaffirm the links between and within generations, whether through classroom experiences, shared work in the garden, or the fruits of a mom's labor, in the aching maw of grief, and in family and cultural lore. How do each of you see your book speaking to a larger community? Defined how you'd like. And Kalia, since you're first up on my screen, would you mind starting?
I would be delighted. Where Rivers Part, I've always known that I wanted to write it, Jeremy, from the very beginning. I started this journey as a writer at the age of 22. I wrote my grandmother's story in The Late Homecomer. My grandma had never been to school. She didn't know how to read or write, and her big fear is that she would be forgotten. And so I started writing the book very much as an effort to tell her that I would always remember and that I'll carry the stories far. I had this idea even at the age of 22 that one day that if my memories grow wings and they start flying far away from me, that if I put it in a book, then maybe the world might remember for us. So that was the beginning of this journey. As a young writer from an underrepresented community, I knew that no publisher would sign up for 3 books. And so it was The Late Homecomer. And then I followed that with the song Poet, My Father's Story. And this one, my mother's, I didn't want to write it for the longest time because I thought I needed to know what love was. The love that would take a daughter away from her mother. I thought I needed to understand what mothering was because so much of my mother's life has spent mothering me and all of my siblings. And so I waited and waited, and 2020 hit. And suddenly the clock, I understood profoundly, could stop at any time. And I wanted to write the book when my mother was still here so that she could correct me wherever I was making the mistakes. And so I asked her for her permission, and my mother said, "Nobody's going to read it, so that's okay. When you're done, I'm just never going to be in the room when you read from it because I'm going to cry too much, and then you will see me and you will cry too much." And so that was the beginning. But in all of my books, Jeremy, I've tried to use memoir to correct history. You see, my people have been deleted time and again from the history books. And so I learned at an early age that if you write for the papers, then maybe you live for a day. If you write for the magazines, maybe you get a month. If you attempt to do literature and if you succeed, then you live for all of time. And so I wanted to create literature to correct the lack of representation of my people, of my family, of me in our history books. And so for me, memoir creative nonfiction has always been an invitation to enter into the space of real lives and to make that go to work. So that's what I try to do. And that's how I think about it. It is an invitation. And I think all genres are really just invitations. Whatever you need to get to that space so that you can do the work that your heart is burning to do, is dying to do, is living to do.
Beautiful, and thank you, thank you. Which grandmother was it, your maternal or paternal?
The first book was my paternal, and so in many ways it made sense for me to end this with my maternal grandmother, the grandmother who I never met, but I carry her jawbone on me every day.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Um, Teresa, same question for you, my friend.
Yeah, I think some of the ways that people can really connect to this is honestly just to slow down and observe all that's around us. All of us can have access to, land and water, the skies, our plant and animal nations, and they have so much to teach us. So I think my book is a call to ask people to just really take a beat and learn from all that's around us. Take some time to slow down from our busy lives and, consider, observe, listen. This morning I was listening to geese flying over and, it telling us this is a seasonal change. Um, and then really to ask ourselves to consider what is our relationship to land, and from our point of view, Dakota people and probably many indigenous people and beyond, is that the land is our relative. So really calling people to ask themselves, how do we be a good relative? How do we demonstrate being a good relative to the land and to all that's around us? And it really takes us to slow down and be intentional and mindful. So all those things are things that everybody can, connect to and relate to. So you don't have to be necessarily a gardener. You could be going out to the parks but yeah, just calling people into relationship. And we need that now more than ever, that deeper connection, and to really ask ourselves, how am I a good relative?
Thank you. And I thought of you, or I thought of Perennial Ceremony last night as I was outside before bed around 11 with my dogs, and it was a beautiful moon, and I just caught or actually, maybe it must have been this morning because I caught some geese flying north, and I thought about just the change in season and the timing. So thank you so much for that. Lindsay, how about you?
Yeah, I think my book relates to the larger story in the way that Kalia said as well. I really resonated when she talked about your grandmother or your mother worried that the fear that she'd be forgotten. And that's really the theme of my book is I had a fear that my daughter, who was stillborn, would be forgotten. And then there's that parallel as well about motherhood, like what is motherhood? And how do we, for When Skies Are Gray, a Grieving Mother's Lullaby, is like, how do we encapsulate a bereaved mother's love, right? And so the theme that really resonates with the wider community in my memoir that goes beyond the pregnancy loss and stillbirth and infant death and child loss community is what we call in psychology the continued bonds of attachment. So how do we continue to love someone when they're no longer here? Which we can do and we know is an appropriate and healthy way of grieving. We used to, many decades, think that it was just the stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with. And once we worked our way through those, like steps on stairs, we would feel better. And then there was this endpoint to grief. But grief is loving, and grief goes on forever. And so does love. And so it kind of transcends that boundary between life and death, no matter what your spiritual beliefs are. I'm agnostic, atheist, but I still felt a sense of connection to Nora after she died. And that connection actually created more of a sense of connection to the earth, to my community. So kind of like Teresa was talking about. And I'm sure, as you know, Matt's book talks about too, like connection to others and to see that we're interconnected. So mine is really about how grief is love and it can continue on, and that we want to see everybody's version of parenthood, however that shows up in their life.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I even from where you were writing at the or where you were at the time of writing, how much your work in terms of getting out to a larger, whether community or just individuals who, as each of us hit a period of loss, the intensity of losses we feel alone. And so reading and knowing that there are others out there does bring us back into the fold of humanity or human connection. Um, Matt,
Hi. It's interesting writing a book that was never meant to be a book. It was all of these mini stories were just meant for me because as a teacher, when that door clicks shut, it's you and the kids, and that's it for the majority of your day. And so there's no other colleague or adult to like reminisce the things that are happening in your room. I mean, my wife did it for years, but that's she doesn't want to hear every story in my classroom. And so sticky notes really just began as something for me so that when I retire from teaching, I have something to look back on and frankly be proud of. I want to see the work that I did and remember the kids that I worked with because I'm with them for 9 months during the year. They're pretty much family. It wasn't until I went on leave to produce my first book that I thought maybe I should start looking back on these stories because I never did. I had all thousands of these stories and they just kind of sat in a box. And so I started telling some online and realized, oh, when I tell a story, someone else remembers a story. That's interesting. And so I decided to start compiling the ones that I thought were important. And I guess the question of how does this, relate to humanity or the greater audience? I think for me, I hope the book does a couple things. Number one is I want people to understand what actually happens in the classroom. There's a lot of narratives out there about what people think teachers do and what we actually do. And I think teaching content like lessons is about 25% of what we do. And the other 75% is helping kids grow into the person that they want to be and showing them all those different opportunities. So that's one thing. The other thing too is, and I'm going to steal a quote from the amazing author Jason Reynolds. He once said that stories are empathy baking machines. And I have found that by sharing all of these miniature stories, all these people start to see themselves in it, but through the lens of a child. And there's something about viewing a life lesson through the lens of a kid that I think makes it, I don't know if it's more universal or more understandable, but people I think tend to relate to it even more. And I haven't pinpointed why yet. But those are the two things that I hope the book does is remind people that there are other people out there that have similar stories. And I hope people understand what actually happens in the classroom.
excellent, excellent. Thank you. I just looked down and realized that your dog is blended in on the carpet, and it gave me a little a little jump. But
Yeah.
I before I moved up to Minnesota, I was a classroom teacher for about 4 or 5 years, junior high and high school.
Okay.
And I think a lot of having survived a turbulent childhood, my appreciation for the fact that most of what's going on for most students has so little to do with the classroom and what they're bringing in. And
Mhm.
it's like my gratitude to the teachers who helped me is profound. All right, I want to go to one-on-one questions now, and I'm going to go back down, start at the top again. So, Kalia, as I wrote there, I hadn't read your first two books, but I just stunned and thrilled by the strategy of you telling your mother's story directly, and particularly because This is the memoir and creative nonfiction category. I had to keep jumping up a generation so that when you were voicing your mother's experiences, I had to tell myself, this is actually a generation later. This is Kalia telling her mother's story before she even existed. Um, it was beautiful and haunting and brilliant. How did you arrive at this choice, and did you try it other ways?
You know, Jeremy, I tried every other way, but I knew in the beginning that I wanted the reader to get as close to my mother as possible. You know, just as when you look at the cover of Where Rivers Part, it is my mother standing in the world on a bright day, an umbrella to shield, the sun. Exactly. I wanted the reader to enter into the world of my mother. As a teacher of writing, I know that there's nothing quite like the first person for doing that. As a daughter, taking on your mother's voice is an incredibly intimidating task. And so I tried every other way I could, and I hid against myself. It was my own fears. Now, I belong to a grandmother who taught me that we build our lives because of our faith, not our fears. But when I went to my mother with my predicament, she looked at me. You know, I'd grown up as a selective mute in English. I didn't whisper until I went to college, and then I only began speaking to be heard when I became a published author. So I went to my mom and I said, Mom, I don't know how to take on your voice. And she looked at me for a long time and she said, do you know how many times I have spoken so that your needs might be met? I've spoken so that you might be heard in the world and hopefully understood. So my mother freed me, Jeremy, to chase after the story in the first person. You know, in the kinds of stories that I tell, I know that I'm not good enough. I know that it would be so much more powerful if the world could just hear my mother speak in English, or my father speak of his songs, sing his songs to the world. But I do it, Jeremy, because I also understand that sometimes I'm the best chance they get. With my books, I'm never working for agreement or disagreement. I'm always working toward a deeper understanding. You know, people will come to my talks, they'll read Where Rivers Part or The Late Homecomer or The Song Poet, and they'll say, I read it because I wanted to learn more about your people. I didn't understand that I would learn more about myself. There's a universality that connects us all, and there's the beating heart of humanity. And my understanding after some 20 years as a writer is that all of us, it is the garden of humanity that we harvest. And no matter what we're writing about, it is our human experience of that we're documenting for the world, for all of time. Every book then is a love letter. And there are few in the world who has loved more graciously, more fearlessly than my mother. And so I wanted my readers to be as close to her as they could get, knowing that I would be that thread in between.
Thank you so much. It was it's so that's so well articulated, and it was such a stupendous tightrope that you did. I mean, it was, and I also think I would push back a little bit that there was so much in reading your book that I was so starkly reminded of the challenge of being an immigrant into America. Like, and especially with the language and cultural difference, but also just the kind of American stolidity, white American stolidity, in that if you pass, you can fit in, and if you don't pass, you have to get in. And so, even if that's not what you're going for, the amount I took away was humbling and inspiring. So, thank you for that.
Well, Jeremy, I think the reality is, people ask me, oh, Gilia, you're so controversial. You're so DEI. And the reality is that there was never any other thing I could have been in America. You know, I'm a tiny Hmong woman in this body with black hair and brown eyes. I'm super short. I'm looking up at the whole wide world. You know, I grew up in a home that practiced shamanism and ancestral worship in a world where every coin, every dollar I held said, in God we trust. I've always known that in telling the stories of who I am, I would be offering to white America, to mainstream America, perhaps a lens, not only into myself, but into who they are. And so these threads for me are all entangled. And I mean, this is why I'm so moved this year by the Minnesota Book Awards at a time and in a world where so many of the identities that I inhabit are quickly becoming illegal. That group of readers from my home state would say, look at this book as something to offer all of us, no matter where we're positioned, and that the ultimate goal is that we can open up our hearts to each other. And so, yeah, I'm very proud of the work that this book and all of my work does in our world, however it needs to do it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well said. Well said. Teresa, um, correct me if I mispronounce, but you write about Mitakuye Owasi.
Close. Mitakuye Owasi. Yeah.
Okay. And I feel that concept could be the point or core of this book. Can you speak on it as a belief and as part of your writing for our audience? And
Yeah.
thank you for helping with the pronunciation. I
Yes,
apologize.
absolutely. Got to learn a little bit of our Minnesota's original language, the Dakota. Yeah, Mitakuye Owasi. For Dakota people, we use that often, especially at the end of a prayer, for example, kind of like an amen. But it's deeper than that. It translates loosely as all my relations. And you can imagine if you're saying a prayer or a blessing or something carrying some weight to it, ending that with Mitakuye Owasi is like speaking from your truth, honestly and with deep respect. And it's an understanding that what I'm sharing is understood because we are relatives to each other. And I would kind of be maybe the same as namaste or something like that. I see the light in you and you and me, and we're all the same. And so, I always kind of have this phrase about, Western science is finally catching up to indigenous thought and ways of knowing. And that's one of them, is that what happens here impacts across the globe. We know about the butterfly migrations and floods that are happening end up, so it's all connected. And so it's that understanding of that. And so again, you would use that really to emphasize that understanding of we're all connected. And of course, that's the theme throughout the whole book, is looking at how we look at the world, how we treat the world, how the decisions we make in the world. For example, I write a little bit about, some of my observations where I question the things that we're doing are done not with that in mind. How are we treating the water? The use of overuse, application of chemicals, and, we got a lot of tiling going on. And, how does that end up impacting the waterways and the flooding that ends up impacting our neighbors downriver? So it's that Mitakuye is with that understanding. And so I think if we could really, and I think it's something that all of us, we can embrace that idea. And again, it really takes, I think, slowing down and being observational and really asking ourselves, how are we being a good relative to the land and water? Yeah. Oh, I want to, since everybody's citing just one really great author, I have to say this. I really love it when I find other writers from, maybe not from a Dakota perspective that really understand that concept. And so I'm a fan of Mary Oliver, the late Mary Oliver, and she writes, "The farthest star in the mud at my feet, our family." So she got that concept of Mitakuye Owasi. So we can all embrace and step into that.
That was about three-quarters of the way through the book on the left-hand page. That was a great reference. Uh, and and you write towards the end about kind of being apolitical, like the struggle between being apolitical and having to confront the political. And I think while there's so much that's straightforward and heartfelt and practical and pragmatic in your presentation, as you come up against the like tiling, like the water table, all those things, the reality is we cannot live a more grounded, simple life without the interference of essentially of capitalism. So rapacious
Mhm.
greed, and so that tension between how do we get to be our better selves individually and community? How do we reconnect with the earth? And trying to have conversations with people who are only looking at a profit margin, which from your book written, more than a year ago until what's happening now in the larger culture, right? How hard that is, and how much I think many of us are now feeling, understanding how these threads are connected. Right. And so, not just how many people are like, well, I better learn how to can and grow my own food because we're not going to be able to afford or find it. And so, how many of these lessons that are commonsensical and also require kind of rethinking a white Western presumptiveness. But your book, you did such a nice job presenting material like food for thought and also recipes and also both spiritual and political information in
Mhm.
ways that without trying to start battles, right, without trying to
Yeah.
quote be political. And I think that was really cool.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you for
really
that.
want to invite readers in. I really want to invite the audience in to really think about. I mean, land and water affects all of us. We all need to eat. We all need to drink water. Yeah. So I hope that it calls people to really question and especially in the time that we are, to really think about doing something different, and questioning, our actions around, and aligning it really again. How do I be a good relative? How do I think about the future generations? And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Lindsay, as I say, I was quite young when my mom died, too young for concrete memories. I spent a lot of time as a child searching for her, and then I grew to accept her death and her absence. Time passes, and we travel along the paths of our lives. And I ask myself, like, what is fidelity to a ghost? I thought often about that while reading your book, the hard permanence of loss and separation, and yet, and yes, life continues if we're fortunate. So, my question is, has your understanding of loss, of the thorny jungle of grief, changed with time and living? How has your relationship to Nora, the memory and idea of her, grown and shifted over time and as you've progressed?
Wow, that's a big question. And I think it's one that a lot of my clients come to see me for as well. So I'm a therapist who specializes in pregnancy loss and infant death and child loss, and kind of walk others through this journey as well. And I was hoping my book would just be a way for those who can't work with me in therapy to, see some of the ways that I navigated grief and that they could then resonate with someone else who's been there before them. Because a lot of times people come to me just to see that I've survived. Like I am a survivor 10 years out, 11 years out, 12 years out, who I am happy. There is life after loss. There is love that lives on. And I think really what it is from a therapeutic perspective and also personally and in my writing, it is about creating those bonds of attachment to the one that we're missing, about identifying and leaning into that identity as a bereaved mother, especially in my case, and for those who don't have any other living children. You don't just lose your identity, or your relationship to the child that died, you also lose your identity as a parent in the world in the way that society often sees you, parents, when they carry their living baby with them. So for me, the book was a love letter, but it was also a way to continue that bond of attachment. And I think what we noticed in psychotherapy and my writing and my own experience is that if we can continue that relationship, if we can integrate that person into our family story, then we find a way to continue that love. And so in the beginning, it's very intentional and intense. Like she was thought of every day. She was part of everything, and I saw her everywhere. And as time goes on, as I get to towards the end of the book, the children that came after her are not a replacement. They're here because she can't be here. And in some ways, I walk, and our family walk in this world of living after death that incorporates her into our story. We still have a holiday stocking for her. We still feed the birds out front as a way to remember her. But those acts of loving and continuing bond have just been built into our lives. And then we always remember her and her place in our story, and we continue on to honor her and that she was here.
Excellent. Thank you. Was it Mary Gaitskill's memoir that you quoted in the book?
I quoted a couple people's memoir. The person who impacted me the most and who I read right at the beginning was a book called, it was written about 10 years before my loss. No, her loss was about 10 years before mine. And then the book came out a couple of years before my loss. And it's called The Exact Replica of a Figment of
Yeah,
My Imagination
right.
by
Right. And that's Gateskill, right? Yeah.
It's Elizabeth
Because
McCracken.
McCracken, I'm sorry,
That's okay.
they're they were publishing at similar times. McCracken actually was they're both amazing.
Yeah.
But McCracken, I remember your first response reading in earlier or midway through the book was like utter disbelief. This
Yes.
idea that how can I ever get like how dare someone say like like I can't remember the exact quote, but it's a duality. It's like it's a
Yeah.
life goes on and you're lost, right? And then by the end of the book, you've progressed enough
Yeah.
to be able to understand that concept better. Like, and so much of it is like that the challenge I think of writing out of and into the immediacy of grief, because as with a heartbreak, as with a broken bone, as with a death, in the immediate aftermath, everything is destabilized. And yet, if we're fortunate, we keep living. And I like that with you came back to the McCracken. I thought that was
Yeah.
nice.
Her line is actually, it's a happy life and
Yes.
someone, I think.
Yes. There we go.
And
Thank
she
you.
keeps it at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Um, Matt, I believe that you have thousands of stories. Um, and I also believe that your wife doesn't want to hear them all.
Yeah.
How did you pick which tales to tell? And then how did you shape and order them? And then finally, are there any, whether in the book or not, that haunt you?
Sure, that's a good question. So in the thousands of stories that I have probably only looked at about 5% of them, and that included when I went through the book. And so it would have been a really long task for me to go through all of them and pick 100. And so kind of the first qualification for choosing a story is I had to be able to protect the kid's privacy. Because even though I'm there, it's not necessarily my story to tell. And most of the stories that I tell, you hear that I'm there, but it's very much focused on the student. And so I changed names for privacy. Um, and then, I wanted to pick 100 stories that showed all different things. It would be really easy to pick 100 stories of like uplifting moments from my classroom. But that's not what I wanted to highlight, at least in this book. So making sure I protected privacy, making sure all the stories were different. Um, and the question of are there stories that haunt me? I think any educator will give you a story that haunts them. I mean, from having to sit on the phone with Child Protective Services, knowing that if you don't get a hold of someone right now, that kid doesn't have a place to sleep or maybe something to eat. But I also have a family to go home to. Like, how do you balance that? And how do you make sure that everyone's getting what they need? Those are the moments that haunt me the most. Um, but there's a lot of stories that I wish I could tell that I'll never be able to, I don't think, because number one, I can't honor the student that it's about. The story needs to honor the person that it's about. And it also needs to be a story. The stories that I can't tell are ones that are not meant for me to tell, which is really hard because there's a lot of stories that I think could give people new perspective on what not just kids are dealing with, but what people in America are dealing with, what people from different cultures and religions deal with. And there's so many stories I wish I could just say like, oh, but if you guys understood what this kid had to go, but I can't because it's not mine. And to give you like an example, I have so many stories about kids going through figuring out who they are, identity, stories where kids don't agree with their parents on identity, and just moments of complete heartbreak. But in that heartbreak, I think there's a lot of lessons and takeaways. But that is such a personal story. There's no way I could tell it. Even if I protected the kid's privacy, that is not my story to tell. And maybe someday there'll be a way to honor those individuals in a way that helps people learn and understand. But right now, I can't think of a single way to do that. And maybe that's telling enough to where it's maybe more concrete that that's just not for me to tell. Yeah, I think, does that answer the question? I think that answered the question fully.
It did.
Um,
Thank you. Yeah, keep going.
yeah. I was going to say too that, crafting the book and choosing like where they went. When I first pitched the book, the editor initially thought, well, maybe they should be longer. Because when you open up my book, I think the stories are less than like 200 words and they're double spaced. It reads more like poetry than it does maybe a narrative. But I think by me choosing less words, it gets to the heart of the story much faster. And that's really what I do is I want to present the story on a plate and leave it for the reader and let them chew on that narrative for a little bit and see what they take from it. And then the order, I, for lack of a better phrase, I wanted to shock the reader. So I didn't want to just put a bunch of like uplifting stories together. I wanted to go from one to maybe something a little hard to hear to back to something else. Because I think it's almost like starting with a fresh palette. I want you to start this narrative over because it's about someone else. You shouldn't be reading them as they're one together.
Excellent. Thank you. Well said.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
if someone asks you what your memoir is about, will you correct them or try to explain what you were going for? As I think only Lindsey's fits the category strictly of memoir. Is
Yeah.
creative nonfiction a satisfactory category or label for what each of you have done? How do you prefer to define or express your work? And let's start with you, Matt, and work our way back.
Sure. That's a really good question. The first thing I think of is when I think of memoir, I think of personal, right? So it's about me. And this book is not about me. I just happen to be there, is how I think about it. And so I don't really know how to qualify my book. I'm a storyteller and like to present stories for people to learn and listen from. And so, if someone were to ask me what category would you put this in, I don't really know, but I like the idea that nonfiction can be a collection of not just me, can be a collection of many different things. And I haven't had anyone say that it's in the wrong category or anything like that. But I really appreciate the ability to put together such a collection of stories. I don't think I'll ever be one that can tell my own life story. I think I would get too rooted down in details that don't matter. But when you view your life in third person, you get to view everybody else's that's around you. And that's when you start to see these beautiful interactions. It's these things when you're not thinking of just yourself. And so creative nonfiction, sure, I'll take it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Lindsey, how about you?
Like you mentioned, it's definitely very much a memoir, and it was written from that perspective and a place of better understanding myself and grief and hopes that others could understand the experience as well. It was neat to, when I worked with my writing coach, Kate Hopper, who's part of the community in Minnesota, she was really great. But she taught me that I had to go back and look at my life as a story. So like look at my family members and friends and therapists as characters and really pick out like what makes them unique and what makes them individuals. And that was harder to do, to kind of sculpt them into form for the page. But it was a neat challenge. But I definitely would say it's memoir with a little bit of self-help. So there's some like little tidbits of how psychotherapy and psychology kind of helped me get through, and things I know from the professional field as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Melissa Phoebos, who is a contemporary writer, memoirist, and she's tremendous. Her, I mean, again, it's a memoir, but it's also creative nonfiction called Body Work. Body of Work? Body Work. Body and Work, there might be an of in there. Is it's a just a brilliant and sharp discussion about how do we tell our stories, who do we owe, and the margin between telling our story versus the fact, kind of as Matt was saying, we're all in this together. And so my freedom to talk about you is limited between legal and ethical and just good taste, or am I willing to lose you as a friend? But it's one for all of us who are wrestling with how we write about others that I really recommend. I think and she's just dynamite. Um, Lindsey, thank you for that. Teresa,
Yeah, I haven't really been trained in like the literary, all of that. And so I honestly don't really care about the different genres that literature plays in. I just write for what makes sense. And so, for example, as you know, I have poetry in there and I have recipes in there as well. And I included them, because I wanted to, and I didn't worry about, oh, does this fit within, creative fiction memoir? Um, and, in terms of the other question around like, how would I, present this to readers or correct them, what I think the book is about, I honestly, I think part of, as an artist, we're really to just challenge our own boundaries and everything. So, same with them. I'm really not going to relegate their understanding to what my understanding is. I'm sharing my experiences with land, water, plant, and animal relatives, my own spirituality. And so, those are my experiences, and I anticipate other people will have different experiences. But with that said, I know that we all have those experiences of interacting. And so I think that people will, consider what it means for them. And I'm totally good with that.
Well put. Uh, and I think it's only when the bean counters or the people trying to stuff us in categories get involved that what is this really becomes a problem. Teresa, you and I share both an editor, well, a press, an editor, and a copy editor. The wonderful Eric Anderson and the stupendous uh, Mary Byers worked on my book as well as yours, and they might probably say that you and I could benefit from a little bit more structure. Although I think Eric's rock and roll true self appreciates us going with what we want to go with. So it was cool to see that we share that. Thank you for sharing. Kalia, how about you?
Well, Eric Anderson is wonderful. He's also my University of Minnesota editor. Two books in, another one coming out, two more after that. So he's wonderful. So lots of love to Eric Anderson and the team there. Um, I write across genres. I write for children and I write for adults. And I think the thing that drew me to CNF and to memoir as a possible home in the beginning was its focus on truth. I would be doing a great disservice to my family and my community and the stories that had made me if I'd done it under the heading of fiction. And that relationship to truth, I think, is so important when it is history that I'm correcting. At the same time, a writer like me just doesn't emerge simply because we have a story to tell. Jeremy, I'm interested in making room in the language, enlarging its boundaries. So my very first book, The Late Homecomer, right on the cover, a family memoir. It's a family memoir. Somewhere in the Unknown World, a Minnesota Book Award finalist the year it came out, 2020, the pandemic. It is a collective memoir. It is refugee stories from wars of the last 100 years, from people around the world, all collected here in the American Midwest, in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities. I'm interested in pushing the boundaries of meaning in English, in our understanding of what each genre can do, not only to the writer, but to the reader. I think so often, as our history has shown us, we're so caught, in dates and names and in containers. Everybody says the Vietnam War ended in 1975 because American troops withdrew from Laos. That is not true. For the Hmong, even now in the jungles of Laos, there are some 800 families still running from a war that the world has declared over. Part of the job and the responsibility, I think, of a writer, particularly one of nonfiction, is to point your gaze to the truths, the complicated, the nuanced, the uneasy truths of being human, of living in a continuous history. As we're here talking, all of us know that there are wars being waged around the world, that so many stories are going to end before they get to begin, and that in a few generations so many more stories will emerge to teach us all the things that we didn't understand. We're limited by our experiences of being human. With a wrong stroke, we can mess it up. The history, the facts, all of that could be skewed. So it is writing with a kind of gravity, a kind of responsibility toward the world. I think which explains why I'm so excited to jump more fully into adult fiction. You know, kind of, I can feel lightness in the air. I can feel um, my own heart beating much freer. At the same time, I never wanted to become a writer because I wanted it easy. You know, the writers I've always gravitated toward were the ones who wrote the real stuff. George Orwell, you know, Baldwin, Angelou, Morrison, um, Amy Tan, you know, Maxine Hong Kingston, the woman warrior. So complicated. Was that memoir? Can we argue that that's memoir? I don't know, but that makes room for me. The possibility of me emerges because of that book. And so call it what you need to call it. I understand that in the realm of nonfiction, I'm beholden to a kind of truth that must live beyond me in the network of relationships that surround me. But in relation to the history books, history will remember us in whatever ways it needs to, it wants to. Uh, but I think if you say you're going to tell a true story, you better make sure that it is as true as you can be.
Thank you. Well said. Thank you all. That's great. Let's go to, I'm going to jump in the middle. Let's go to Lindsey. How has your work as a grief counselor or loss counselor affected your perspective on your experiences and then also on how you inform other people? So this is a little bit less about writing and more about interpersonal stuff.
Yeah, well, I'd say like experiencing a loss of my child at a younger age, like when I first set out on the journey of becoming a parent, it really, as someone who comes with a lot of privilege in life, as a white woman, a straight woman, I came from a good socioeconomic, well, a higher, we were financially fortunate is what I meant. It was eye-opening to see how much pain and devastation I could carry within me. And then it helped me connect wider to the wider world of like how much pain and devastation and trauma. I mean, experiencing a pregnancy loss and then the death of a child is traumatic, but how much the world carries trauma with them every day. It made me, and not that there's a silver lining to losing a loved one at all. It did open me up in my younger eyes of seeing how much suffering is in the world, though, and being a kinder person towards people because of that, and understanding everybody comes in with their own journey or whatever that quote is. It's like you never know. Somebody's probably going to remember it, like how hard of a day somebody else is having. And I think it helped me connect with my humanity more in that way. I think it also helped me connect with nature and community in a larger level and seeing that both are there to support us and we have to be stewards of those things as well. When it comes to being a therapist, it helped me expand my work and realize that grief is love. And how do we, grief work is quite magical work. I know most people think it probably sounds depressing and not a place you want to be, but when you can tap into the love that someone has for the person they lost, there's so much there. It's a big privilege to be able to sit with people as they grieve. And so that's what I enjoy doing about my work. And my experience helped connect me with a wider, as parenthood does, I do believe that was part of it too, help me connect to a wider humanity.
Excellent. Thank you. Teresa, the acts of naming, renaming, erasing, and reclaiming reflect ongoing struggles with oneness and identity. Your book brings the reader into deeper understanding and consideration of the sacredness of the land and the history embodied in the soil as well as in us. I think I took this from page 39 of Bingo. Will you discuss your intention in Perennial Ceremony to illustrate names, places, and histories for our interconnection? And then anything else you want to share on that?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say I'm not really a big fan of some of the place names throughout our state and country that are named after typically old white guys. And then, because we find out something about them later and then we regret that and we take them down. And then, of course, now there's a bunch getting put back up. And I really like the tradition that's often in our Dakota community is naming places based on our relationship to that land or that water, or perhaps something that occurred there, or some regular occurrence, maybe a gardening spot, or where these certain black oak trees are always, they're there. Our relationship to that space. So I really feel like, and I say this, of course, in there, so much that these renaming of places is really about erasure. I mean, we've kind of talked about that here as well, the erasure of a people. And so renaming, reclaiming spaces that reflect, that Minnesota is Dakota homelands, is important, to address invisibility. So again, just like really holding on to spaces for what that land does for us, our relationship to it, just again really helps with our own connection to place and brings us into honoring that space.
Thank you. Matt, I gotta make sure I put all your books up. Ta-da! Matt, you've talked a little bit already about how you wanted to vary and pick the examples or the stories, vignettes you used. Did you want there to be, or have you thought about whether there is a through line that pulls these short insights together, or that there's a cumulative effect, kind of a pointillism of the vignettes? Because as you're right, they're about 200 words each, and you wanted not to only have type A or type B, but did you, when you were editing and placing them, have kind of an overall cumulative effect in mind?
I don't know that I did when I started, but it's interesting when you're combing through, we'll call it data. Stories are data. You're combing through all this data, you start to see trends and you start to see things that play off of each other. And I think depending on the reader, you might see a different through line between all these stories. But I think for me, the thing that I want people to understand is that there is always a story within the story or the thing that you're viewing. And so for me, when I wrote these memories down, I did begin to write them down just for their face value effect. Oh, this was a cute moment. Oh, this was very funny. And when you get time to sit with that story longer and try and remember it, you start to see things that you didn't before. I think that's a lesson in itself of, maybe greater society, of meeting new people or witnessing an event, is there is always something else within there that you just don't know about. Right? In my classroom, we talk a lot about like what is the missing narrative? What are we not seeing that needs to be represented here, or what could be? And it's okay to make predictions because they're based in empathy and understanding. And so I guess the through line for me is just that there's always these stories within a story, and they can carry some really powerful moments.
Thank you. Yeah. Kalia, as a writer who honors her heritage and yet recognizes what I call the unidirectional severance of connection with your faraway relatives, how did researching and writing the narrative affect your sense of cultural identity? I mean, so much of the end of the book, the final movement, when going back with, well, I mean, and again, it's your mom's story, but going back and not just the family, like the family who are lost, but then how much she, and then at the coda you wrestle with that. Could you speak on that, please? And I'm sorry, that's a poorly phrased question. I apologize.
No, it's a wonderful, wonderful question. You know, Jeremy, from the onset, I understood that there was a story of Kalia Yang that she could not control. The fact that I was born a stateless child in a refugee camp, and that at the age of 6, I would come to America and a different kind of possibility would begin. I was 22 years old when my grandmother died and when I set out to become a writer. I was 25 years old when I graduated from Columbia's MFA program with a manuscript in hand, and there was an invitation to stay in New York and to teach. But I thought, wait, if there's going to be a story of Kalia Yang, the writer, shouldn't she come forth from the biggest urban population of Hmong in the world, the Twin Cities? And so I came back very consciously to begin my story as a writer here. And then there were other questions, right? Isn't it great that I first come for, like my story as a writer begins from Coffee House Press, one of the fine independent publishing houses here in Minnesota, and that has been the trajectory of my career, which goes back to your question. I think there is a deliberateness. My father has always said that words have to write on memory because I come from a culture that's been divorced from a written language for such a long time. Words have had, they have to live in memory, they have to write on memory. Which meant that when we were arguing when we were much younger, my dad would say to us, "Is that really what you want to buy with your words?" My older sister and I. Was that really what you want? And it would force us to stop and halt and then think again, try it from a different angle, a different way. And I think that has been such a useful life lesson, but also so fundamental to my identity as a writer and the work that I do in reclaiming history in all of my books. I'll tell you a little bit about the return. When my mother returns to Laos and we enter into her family's compound, they came out and they came running toward me, my uncles, because I looked more like the 16-year-old who had walked away from them, not the 60-year-old woman coming out of that car. And I knew exactly why they were running toward me, and my mother knew as well. When you're a kid, you want to romanticize the reunion. I think she's missed them so much and they've missed her so much, and they can't wait to hold each other close. When you're there in that moment, you understand the complications of 40 years, under different regimes, under different governments, history written and rewritten again and again. It's incredibly complicated, the work of being human, and I think this connects to Lindsey's thing. Bodies die, but love lives on. Old houses don't grow new rooms. We must make room within ourselves. In Hmong, there's a saying, the house may be little, but the heart is large. I think in doing this research, writing these stories, I understand how much my heart can hold. There's so much to talk about, Jeremy. One day, if I get to meet the grandma I've never met, if I get to meet her, there's so much I want to tell her. All of those old cassette tapes she used to send when I was a kid. Menai, you don't know me, but I'm your mother's mother and I love you. And I could never say it back because I wasn't sure how to love a stranger and I didn't want to lie. Jeremy, one day when I return to the house of my ancestors and she's there, I know what I want to say. I want to tell her that I've lived my life waiting to love her, understanding that whether I knew it or not, I was sailing already on the winds of her love. That war took away so much, but it didn't take away her impact on my mother or my mother's impact on me. Where River's part ends in that jungle where my mother, 16 years old, walks away from her mother forever because she didn't know it. She thought she was falling in love and she thought somehow the soldiers would hold and there would be another day. I take her back to that jungle, to the woman who loves her best in all of the worlds. And I take her back into her mother's arm. But Jeremy, I'm not a fool. I know that when my mother is in my grandmother's arms again, she will be far away from me. And that is the thing that I've never been able to read to my mother. But I see, because she has the book right by her bedside, that she has read that final page again and again and again. And I know that as much as she loves me and wants to be here with me, I know that her heart also understands that there are people waiting for her on the other side. And that's the thing about being a writer. Our imaginations, our visions of what could be can bring us there. So, yeah, acknowledging the loss, but also reclaiming it.
Thank you for that. What would you ask your grandmother?
It's like giving me candy, Jeremy. The question is like offering candy to a kid. When I was writing this book, I talked to my aunt, my mom's little sister, and she told me the story about how when my mother left with my father that night, uh, one of the female dogs had also left, and how the next day they went looking and looking, and the dog returned, but my mother didn't come back. They couldn't find her. And my grandma looked at my aunt and she said, if missing could kill, I would be dead. If yearning can kill, your mother would be gone. I want to ask her about all of the people she's missed. All of the people she's missed. I want to give her an opportunity, even if it's just with our words, to let me meet them. I think that would be so special.
That is lovely. Thank you. Thank you to our tremendous memoir and creative nonfiction category finalists, and to all of you who are watching and listening to me ramble. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, Friends of St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. And in particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, April 22nd. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 9 others are finally revealed. Please join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for Performing Arts. Tickets are $29 and they're going fast. A free live stream will be available, and visit friends.org/MNBA for details. Thank you very much. Have a great day.